I want to go to this one, also very, very important in terms of Africa's vaccine program. The 82nd International Pharmaceutical Federation Congress taking place for the first time last week on South African soil. This four-day Congress brought together pharmacists from all across the world to share expertise, networks and knowledge in technology innovations. So the issue of vaccine production on the African continent dominated those discussions. And senior executive from Aspen Pharmacare Holdings, Dr. Stavros Nicolau, joins us now to talk about this. Stavros, good morning. Thanks again for your time. Now, we know historically you have lamented the shortcomings of our vaccine production on the continent, prominently during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Africans were simply left at the mercy of the world when it came to vaccine provision. And here we are 4 years later, we're facing the blight of mpox. Has anything changed? Have we made credible inroads in vaccine manufacturing from surface level? It would appear no.
Iman, firstly, thanks very much for having me, and good morning to all your viewers. As you correctly point out, last week, the 82nd International Pharmacy Federation Conference was held for the first time in sub-Saharan Africa. Rather poignant that there was a significant chunk of the program dedicated to health security on the African continent, vaccine security. So good that we hosted this in Cape Town for the first time, as I said, in 82 years. But disappointingly, and again in the context of new outbreaks of regional pandemics, mpox in this instance, to respond directly to your question, very little progress has been made. We've been speaking about a lot of things and good plans, and those plans are yet to materialize fully. So it's little surprise that when mpox, or the new strain of mpox, began manifesting in DR Congo about 3 weeks ago, and all your viewers will recognize it's a more virulent strain than the previous one, which we experienced about 18 months ago. Being more virulent, it's also more transmissible, we believe, and it's starting to affect a number of countries on the African continent. It spread to so far 14 countries and could spread beyond that. And the disappointment, as I said, is that mpox vaccines do exist, but they've been stockpiled and procured some time ago by wealthier nations, and now you have Africa relying on either scrambling to try and source its own vaccines or relying on donations. Neither of those are sustainable options, and neither are they the options that we agreed to 4 years ago. 4 years ago, we said we would use the crisis of COVID, turn it into an opportunity where we establish procurement of vaccines, all vaccines, not just outbreak vaccines, but also routine vaccines for African patients from African producers, and very little progress, regrettably, has been made. These are not difficult things, I believe, to solve. At the conference, Professor Glenda Gray and I proposed a 4-point plan, which we are now communicating far and wide. It enjoys the support of the African vaccine manufacturers, and I also believe Africa CDC, and we now need to get to grips with this plan and start implementing, so we never fall short again.
And I want to come back to what we do next, and more importantly, how we, muscularize our own capabilities. But it makes me so angry to hear you say the same thing that you're saying now, that echoes to what we heard during the pandemic, where we see wealthier nations having stockpiled things and in a sense making these concessions to the African continent in terms of what allocation they will make, and always it seems as if there's this band-aid solution, as some healthcare experts have said. At the moment, we need, I think, something like 10 million doses to deal with, for mpox particularly, to deal with mpox on the African continent, but we find ourselves again reaching out and begging others to help us out. And so it really is so angering, and I just wanted to place that on record. You made a really sobering point at the conference, Stavros, that it was a sad indictment that agencies procure next to no vaccines from Africa, yet Africa, for example, sits with 70% of the world's HIV-infected population and has to import most of our ARVs. That could never make any sense.
Yeah, Iman, it certainly doesn't, and that's why we proposed this 4-point plan. And you know, in the time constraints that we've got, let me just focus on two of the points which are really important. The first is, for any manufacturing to survive on the continent, we need to have sustainable demand, sustainable offtakes, and we need to support the local capacities. It's no use saying, look, Africa, put up these capacities, and then the international procurement agencies continue buying these products outside of the continent. I mean, ARVs, we import more than 80% of our antiretrovirals into Africa, yet we are saddled with 70% of the infection rate. The second point that needs to be made is that the regulatory obstacles need to be addressed. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that to get a product sold into Africa requires a number of steps. First, you have to receive a technology transfer. There are regulatory processes related to that. Then you've got to get the product registered here in South Africa by SAPRA, our drug regulator. Then you've got to submit to the World Health Organization for pre-qualification. And then lastly, in many instances, you have to register the same products in the country that you're selling to in Africa. So imagine what an unwieldy and cumbersome process that is. And by the time you get all of that, you know, the emergency is gone and patients are dead. So we have called for an urgent review of the WHO pre-qualification process, meaning we seek priority review and parallel submissions, so that these happen as parallel steps. They're not go first step, complete it, go second step, third step, and then eventually get there. We are calling for parallel submissions. And very lastly, Iman, we have said as Aspen, our group CEO went out about 3 or 4 days ago, and he said, you know, we are prepared to look at producing MPOX. However, who pays for the technology transfer, and are there offtakes?
Yeah.
You can't expect Aspen or any manufacturer to go into production, say, look, we're going to produce MPOX, stockpile it, and then no one buys it, and you write that off. That's not a way to sustain manufacture on the continent. So the 4-point plan and the 2 points in particular that I've embellished a little on, those are important 4 points that we get full political support, but more importantly, that there is operational execution of these points. In other words, Iman, less talking and more doing will hold us in good stead. And just, sorry, very lastly on that, you know, we've got a public procurement bill that was signed into law. It's now an act. And they say charity always starts at home. And we now have a public procurement act. We've got to ensure that all the agencies of government follow that act. Otherwise, we are going to continue denuding industrial capacity in the continent. When we have these emergencies, we can't cope with them.
Because I'm also thinking, and I mean, I didn't write this down for this interview, but as you're mentioning the point, I mean, I'm recalling Aspen, you know, setting up that treatment or the manufacturing plant in Gqeberha during the COVID-19 pandemic to create some of those vaccines, and that didn't work out so well in terms of not being able to have those offtakes or being able to distribute or disseminate those drugs or those vaccines. You can just correct me on the facts there if I'm wrong, but that, I guess, is the lesson that you're saying we need to draw on in terms of how we move forward with, you know, with creating or building our own vaccine capabilities, making sure that there is a market and a place for all of that to go to. Just quickly correct me if I was wrong there on any of that detail before we move to the closing point.
No, you're quite right. And the sad indictment is that, you know, millions or over 1 billion vaccines were procured from COVAX and Gavi, and not a single dose from an African producer. So you're quite right in what you're saying.
So let's go to the priority diseases. Okay, so we know COVID-19 caught the entire world off guard, and people, developed countries that were more capacitated to deal and provide and distribute vaccines did so. Others like us had to learn some deadly lessons. We saw how many people died. We're dealing with Mpox now, similar situation, a really tragic echo throughout the African continent in terms of access to those drugs. So when we're thinking about technology transfers, when we're thinking about building our own capabilities, what are some of the other priority diseases, Stavros, that we need to earmark for both vaccine research and development?
Man, that's an excellent question. And to respond, there are two types of vaccines. You get what we call routine vaccines. So these are vaccines that you have to administer on organized programs, organized health programs every year. It includes things like measles, mumps, rubella, rotavirus. So these are bread and butter vaccines that all infants and children get. So those are your routine vaccines. Those have a steady demand. Then you get a different bucket called the outbreak vaccines. So these are vaccines that you need at the time of an outbreak pandemic. Mpox is a good example of that. Mpox is not new. It's been around for some time, but you have a mutation of the virus or the bacterium or whatever it might be, and then you have an outbreak and you've got to deal with that emergency. Now, it's hard to predict or forecast when that happens, but what you do need to have, you need to have sustainable capacity so that when that happens, you can immediately and seamlessly move into technology transfers. In doing those tech transfers, you can go into immediate production. You shouldn't be scrambling around to say, well, have you got the capacity? Is someone going to buy those vaccines, the outbreak vaccines? Will there be an offtake? And will someone fund the tech transfer? All of those steps need to happen well in advance. And if that had happened, we wouldn't be scrambling to get 40,000 vaccines out of a 10 million, as you correctly cite, that Africa needs.
Dr. Stavros Nicolau, thank you very much for talking to us this morning about this really important subject. And we'll watch Africa and South Africa's road and journey towards bolstering our vaccine manufacturing capabilities over the next few years. And that was a senior executive from Aspen Pharmacare Holdings. Still ahead, more news and views.